Hey guys, Thomas the Jr. here, aka Mustached. I'm here to review the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. So, for those of you who may not know, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood is based off of a show that used to air a while back. This is back when I was a kid. This show used to air. And before even going into the movie, I will say that I used to watch the show pretty briefly. I wouldn't say I was someone who was hooked on the show per se. Um, so yeah, there were other shows that definitely had me way more hooked. This is probably around the time when I was like starting to get into like Pokemon and like um, uh, Pokemon and what was the other show? Power Rangers was definitely a show I was way more hooked into, and as I mentioned, I from time to time got a glance at A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Um, there were some surprises in this movie because I didn't watch it as much. I didn't know everything I could know. Um, and then of course from after Pokemon and Power Rangers was like I got hooked onto Digimon. Um, so yeah, so I'll go into my review, and if you end up enjoying my review, then consider joining the link in the description. It'll be the second one that will lead you to my Patreon. Any donations are desperately needed. So we see that Tom Hanks is playing Fred Rogers, or Mr. Rogers, more commonly known. Um, and we also see him opening up the little show introducing a character named Lloyd. Now, Lloyd, according to the movie, was he is the writer of a magazine, and based on everything we know about him throughout the movie, we see that Lloyd is very he's looking for those juicy stories. He's one of those type of writers. Uh, you know, the ones that in the current day would probably just yell fake news and whatever, all that nonsense. But hey, I've come to a surprisingly big cycle of what I think of news these days, and just like YouTube, it's still technically a job, though. YouTube has kind of been the uh, usher in of a new era. But before there was even YouTube, getting in whatever type of headlines you could get, that's how you made money. So I understand. I get it. I'm not even mad at that anymore. People can yell fake news, and I'm just going to sit here and go, yeah, they're making money. Um, and, when it's right, it's right. And when it's not, they're making money. That's about the extent of hurt. And sure, you can have them apologize now, but I don't think firing people is necessarily the right answer there. I think that's a bit unjust, but whatever. Anyway, so Mr. Rogers is mentioning how Lloyd had someone hurt him in his little opening show, and we get a little nice song too. Um, so this is in 1998. So, a while back. I was born in 91, so a few years, I was like 8 or 9, I guess, depending on where August would fall around there. Um, so yeah, um, we see again Lloyd being the writer, um, and he mentions how uh, he has a wife and a father who he got angry with, and we get to see this story play out. So they have a nice little transition throughout the movie of like they have this little toy town that they like sort of move throughout like the old school setup. And we cut to Lloyd talking to his sister about her wedding, and the father is like singing and he's drunk and he We also see Lloyd's wife, Andrea. Meanwhile, when they have a little time to themselves, the father and Lloyd are starting to talk. Um, it causes Lloyd to get angry. He punches his father, and the father hits back, and then there's some other fighting that happens. Um, and we cut back to Mr. Rogers talking about being bullied, and we learn more about I think his name was Philly, the letter carrier, comes on in. Um, and they move up to this picture that shows them how people make a magazine, which is in tone with what Lloyd does. Again, he writes for the magazine. We cut back to him, Lloyd, um, who gets the mission from his boss to write about Mr. Rogers. And again, Lloyd is looking for that, to dig into Mr. Rogers, get that core meat, find something juicy. He sees his father pretty briefly before heading away. And yeah, so he talks to Rogers on the phone pretty briefly. And then afterwards he talks to Andrea, his wife. So he manages to get to the office and talk to Rogers a little bit more. And he sees that Rogers talking to this kid, who is a part of Make-A-Wish Foundation, showing you how old that foundation is. I guess that's been around for a really long time. So we see the show sort of playing out, and we see this woman talk to the cat puppet, who's also puppeteered by Mr. Rogers. And the two of them sing a nice little song. And Lloyd wants to keep asking questions. He feels like he hasn't hit anything solid, he hasn't hit his scoop, as it were, according to him. So yeah, he watches it, and there's this little hint of Lloyd feels like something is about on him or whatever. We see another song. He watches on. After the fact, we see him at home with his wife. Mr. Rogers calls Andrea to just talk or whatever. So they go to they're heading toward the show. This little theater place, and it's Rogers and Lloyd talking some more. But before then, there's the players play a little song for Mr. Rogers. So Lloyd talks to his wife very briefly on the phone, I believe, at this point. So he does a walk and talk with Rogers after the fact, and they end up on this. I think it was either a bus. I think it was a train in the and everyone's pretty quiet, and then a few kids notice Mr. Rogers is on the train, and they start singing the main theme of the show opening, and then other people who don't look like they would be into it start singing it. It's just it's a really interesting moment. It's probably the most oh, I didn't see that coming kind of moment. It feels like something you wouldn't see today. That felt like a spectacle of a bunch of people. Some of the people you would probably say at first glance they look suspicious, and then you see them on one side, and then you see literally on the other side you see these two cops, and you see Lloyd looking at the cops. He does a pan right before the song happens. He does a pan from left to right. On the left hand side you see these very suspicious looking characters or people, and he pans right and he sees the cops, and they look like they have their hands as if they could possibly holster their guns. They just look like they could potentially do something if like something came up. And then the kids are like in the middle. They're like the ones standing up because the train is like full. And then the kids like notice Mr. Rogers, and then they start singing first, as I mentioned. And then all the people on the train start literally singing the song, and it's very, again, it feels like a very like, wow, like that just happened. Like that feels like that, again, that wouldn't happen in the modern day. Like that just doesn't happen. Again, I don't know. So, anyways, that nice little moment passes, and Lloyd gets again another little like moment alone. And Rogers, I guess they're at his house. He like pulls out his two main puppets, like the cat puppet that he has, and this king. I forget their names. I think I wrote down Danny the cat, but I didn't write the king's name, and I know he mentions it, but I didn't write it down. I do apologize for that. So Lloyd opens about his mom because Rogers is kind of interviewing him too in a weird way, and he's like, Lloyd at first is like, "What are you doing? This is an interview. Like I'm supposed to interview you." And Mr. Rogers just replies, "Isn't that what we're doing?" And that to me is a very fascinating, like something I don't see celebrities doing these days. Is like interviewing someone back, like asking about how their day was. Like I don't see that anymore, and that moment I think was like the first time I felt like, wow, that actually got me on like a level of like, we don't do that, do we? Very often, we don't ask the interviewer how their day is, how their life is, what's going on with them. You know, they got shit to deal with too sometimes, especially in today's world. Like, holy fuck, this guy was like really cool. And like the title above his head is "We could all use a little more, a little happy or a little kindness." And that moment to me was the first real eye opener. And I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This movie actually legit made me cry. Um, I, I don't know if I can fully explore why that happened. It just sort of got to me. I don't know. Anyways, so they talk about his mom. Um, and so after the fact, as I mentioned, Roger shows off the puppets, and then Lloyd's trying to get back in. He's trying to get back to the questions at hand, trying to really dig. Still, he's still in that sort of mindset. But Rogers kind of deflects in an interesting way, bringing up the dad again, bringing it back to the interviewer. And Lloyd leaves after that, and he returns home to see his father. All the irony in the world, I guess, and all that. So he wants his father to leave, and the father like has like a heart attack or something, or something equivalent to a heart attack. After Lloyd is like yelling at him about how how his mother like passed away, and how like how his father reacted to it. So he wants to try to focus in back on work. And he sees Rogers in the distance, and he's like trying to follow him. And we see Rogers get on the set. And this is where the movie gets a little bit trippy. It does get a little bit even more fantastical than the train scene, because we cut to a moment where Lloyd has this weird trippy moment where he ends up in a toy town. The toys, he's talking to them about the hospital, because he says he like hates hospitals. He sees a giant Andrea who's singing to him. We cut to him in the hospital with his mom, and I think that's when like I started like actually legit crying, because I was like, oh fuck. We cut back to him in the studio for a brief moment, and we see Rogers and his wife playing the piano. So apparently Lloyd, what really happened is like he passed out or whatever, and then Rogers like brought him to his place. Um, so they eat, and Rogers is talking about like your parents help you become who you are, regardless of like what they're trying to do, and like even if it's do it like a negative scope, like if it's not like absolute abuse, if it's not like the actual worst thing you could do to a kid, um, there's like a lens that you can that you should try to see it through. That's kind of what Rogers is trying to get through. And this is a moment again where it gets a little bit fantastical. Everyone in the area stops, um, because Rogers introduces this little mantra of like, take a moment to breathe, and everyone participates, I guess. Um, so after that, Lloyd talks with Andrea, his wife, and he talks about how he's been angry and scared for a long time. And he just sort of breaks down, and it's just like, damn, another moment that just really got to me. Uh, talking about his fears about death, um, and a new song that'll takes over as that's going on. Uh, so he takes up swimming because that's like one of the things I think Roger's wife mentioned of like if you're angry, you take up like he takes up certain things to like keep himself occupied from letting that anger take hold of him. So he goes to visit his dad, and he begins to write his little piece. And Andrea comes over, so he gets food. Lloyd gets food, and he starts to sing to his baby because Andrea and Lloyd had a baby at some point earlier in the movie. Um, so the father requests that he stay a little bit, and they have a little drink. He says he's sorry, and then the son also apologizes. So Lloyd shares his news, or shares his piece with Andrea, and this little piece hits the cover. That'd be an interesting find, like actually finding the actual article that was that. Anyway, so Lloyd has invited Rogers over, and he actually comes over to their house, and they sit and they talk. And Roger brings up death because the father is passing away, and how it's a part of the human, human life. Um, and that's one thing that I wanted to talk about in the show A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. I actually did not know this originally, that yes, that this particular program for kids actually talked about stuff like death and war, and that shows you how warped and changed society has become, again, as of recently. Um, you probably wouldn't get that very often about like a show that just it says it's for kids, and then it goes on about death, and it goes on about war, and it goes on about these challenging things for kids. And I've come to change my mindset about the whole kid thing again. uh, Despite the whole Copa nonsense that has sort of confused the hell out of all YouTubers, I think that this is a very fascinating movie in this, and that this is a show that, when it used to air for kids, it wasn't afraid to tell kids, hey, death is something that happens. War is something that happens. These aren't things we aren't talking to our kids as much about, and it's something that still affects us to this day. Of course it is. Death happens every single day. We know this. And I think that is something very important to, because our kids are inevitably gonna see it. Um, that's just something that just happens sometimes. Um, and war, again, a very crucial thing that, again, in these days, I don't think as many parents would tell their kids about is like what happens in war, what that's all about. And I'm pretty sure there are other subject matters that would be like, that because those are the two that they mentioned, but I'm pretty sure they probably covered more that I'm not aware of. Um, and again, it makes me reflect on what we see in our modern day television. We get all these kids programs, and they have been there was a long period where they played it extremely safe, and there are only shows that are coming out more and more recently that feels like it's starting to change again, like it's starting to get back to, hey, you know, we can challenge our kids again. It's okay. It's totally fine. They can handle these things. It's perfectly fine. Kids, the meme of like, oh, kids are just all stupid. Like, I say it's a meme at this point, and that's honestly how I feel about it. I think we don't give kids enough credit sometimes, and I love to joke about it too, and I'll follow the meme sometimes, and I'll say kids are stupid or whatever. But if I'm putting away the persona, if I'm talking real, I'm gonna say like kids can handle a lot more than we give them credit for. I think a lot of the time. Um, you'd be surprised about sometimes what things kids can handle. Some can't and some can. It like human beings. Surprise, surprise. Everyone is different, or a majority of people are different from one another. Human brains don't function the same way. Um, every human has a different thought process. We get to different things at different times. It's very unique to the human experience. So that's my philosophical uh, tangent about the human experience. So, anyways, back to the movie. We cut back to Rogers, and he shows us, and it's back in his little studio, and he shows us the last picture in the middle of the family in the holiday picture, and he sings his goodbye song, and he leaves, and he watches the feed, and he goes out to his little piano, and he starts playing his little song, and he does his little anger thing at the end of it, his little anger prevention at the end of it, and then he just starts playing again, and then the movie just fades away. And that was a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And I must say, this movie was one of the more beautiful movies I think I've ever seen this year. Um, you know, Aside from the spectacular nature that was Joker, I feel like this movie is also a movie I would consider a potential for movie of the year just because of how shit the majority of movies, or how mediocre the majority of movies have been this year. Like, holy cow, does this movie really, really stand out in a sore thumb of majority of, like, just really mediocre or really bad movies. I'm gonna give this movie a 9 out of 10. If you have not seen this movie, I highly recommend it. It is so great to see something like this, and it's so great to be reminded of a show like this. A show that challenged youth, a show that brought legit happiness to people, and in a one moment brought happiness to a crowd of people. I have an actual suspicion that that might have actually happened. Like, even though that felt fantastical, like, I could actually believe that that actually happened back then anyway. There are certain things that you don't see anymore. One of the things that this actually reminded me of, and it has nothing to do with this movie, is like those random performances you would see at malls where like certain people would suddenly freeze and then they would do a performance. I'm not even sure what the name of this thing is. Of like when people like are like those type of performers, like they're just like out in the open, and then they freeze, and then they perform, and then they go back to what they were doing. It reminds me of that because that used to be a thing that happened um, at a time, and it doesn't happen anymore. At least I don't see any recent ones happening. I've looked around on YouTube. I don't see any more recent ones that just pop up. So it is like certain things fade, and I feel like again only very recently now we're starting to get back to like, oh, kids can handle certain things, and again I suspect that those certain shows would get more pushback than others, of course, naturally in this era. But again, for this particular movie, again, I highly recommend it. And if you enjoyed this review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, make sure to check out those links in the description. The first will head you over to my Discord server, the other to my Patreon page. Any donations are desperately needed, and until next time, everyone, bye bye.